and welcome to Newsclick. As you're aware, issues of internet governance have been in the media for the last 6 to 8 months following the Snowden revelations. Joining us to discuss these very important issues, we're very glad to have with us Richard Hill. Richard is an independent telecommunications consultant based out of Geneva. He was formerly with the ITU and led their secretarial groups dealing with the new ITRs. He's also been part of the study groups dealing with issues such as numbering, charging and accounting, networks and performance, and so on. Richard, I'm just going to jump straight into the questions. Firstly, why do we need an international body to deal with telecommunications?
Well, not everybody thinks we do, but the fact is, ever since the invention of telegraphy in 1865, there have been international agreements so as to facilitate international telecommunications and so as to make sure that everybody can communicate. So the purpose of those agreements was to agree certain standards, to agree on how the financial flows are settled, to agree on issues such as privacy. And up to now, we've always had such an agreement.
So what role does the ITU itself play in this telecommunication space?
The ITU is just a facilitator of dialogue between member states and also industry groups. So the purpose of ITU is to bring people together so they agree. They can agree treaties, they can agree non-binding resolutions, they can agree standards which are voluntary. And the ITU has always done this, and it has done this to everybody's satisfaction until these internet issues came up, where now, I think we'll explore a little bit more, there's some dissensions about what is the proper role of the ITU and other UN bodies.
Now, given that the ITU appears to be the only legitimate international body dealing with telecommunications issues, why was there such a backlash in the Western media, particularly around the time of the World Conference on Information Technology, regarding the ITU actually dealing with issues of the internet?
This is a matter of interpretation. I'll give you mine. I believe that it's because in the ITU it's a relatively level playing field. Not perfectly level, but it's still more level than the other playing fields where internet policy matters are discussed, which tend to be dominated by the US and their interests. So economic interests, particularly in the US, but not exclusively, and geopolitical interests, almost exclusively from the US, felt threatened by the discussions that were going on in ITU, so they attempted to lock this out. And this is nothing new. As you know from the Global South, there's a general trend of trying to lock discussions out of forums where the Global South is well represented or even in a majority, and move them into other forums where the South is less well represented.
Strategically, what do you think the Global South countries can do then to avoid such situations arising again? For instance, at the Brazil meeting, which is coming up in April this year.
I think you actually just have to keep trying. You have to keep pushing the fact that the UN is the legitimate forum. One country, one vote may not be the perfect system, but surely it's more democratic than some people saying, well, we're democratic and you're not, and we have a process which is better than your process. Maybe, but who is to decide that? And we need to avoid the capture of wrong issues. So one of the things that broke down in Dubai is, as you recall, the press headlines where China and Russia are conspiring to use the ITU to impose censorship. Now, anybody who knows anything would know this is a silly statement and we shouldn't allow this to go unchallenged in the press, but it was largely unchallenged in the press. And why did they say that? Because it's easier to defend freedom of speech than it is to defend my ability to make money because I have a dominant position, or defend my ability to conduct surveillance on a unilateral basis all over the world without any constraints. No, neither of those two proposals is going anywhere, so let's mask the issue. So I think there's an educational process, and I'm glad that you're part of that educational process, to try to bring the Global South up to understand that these are real issues, and no, you don't have to swallow the Western propaganda, you can stand up against it.
Now, this is an issue that you've broadly, just covered just now, but do you believe that the UN is actually a viable framework to deal with such issues, given firstly that the internet has traditionally been standardized in a bottoms-up fashion, also given that the various systemic problems that the UN is accused of, whether it's disproportionate influence of its Security Council members, whether it's problems with transparency and participation and so on. So do you think it's an appropriate forum?
Yeah, I don't think the UN itself should get involved. It would be the specialized agencies, WIPO, ITU, UNESCO, and so on, where some of the structural issues that you mentioned of the UN are less severe. It's true the UN is not perfect. No democracy is perfect. I believe it was Churchill that said, this is a terrible system, but it's the least worst system, so we have to live with it. So I think in the current configuration, it's hard to see anything better. And then The standardization process used in the internet is no more or less bottoms up than any standardization process, and I'm familiar with many of them. The ITU is actually just as bottoms up as the IETF is. The membership composition is different. The IETF is more open, the ITU is less open. Those are differences. But the process itself of standardization is always bottoms up, and it's always on a consensus basis. And if people don't like the standard, they don't implement it, they go somewhere else and they get another one. On the other hand, what is not very often talked about is the fact that the internet is highly centralized from the point of view of the management of the addresses and names, far more so than the other telecommunication technologies. So that this fact that somehow this internet is this giant decentralized organ as opposed to some giant centralized previous organ is completely false. The level of standardization for internet centralization for internet is actually higher in some areas than it ever has been for previous technologies.
Now, my final question, given that India has not yet acceded to the ITRs, what role do you think India can play in formulating a progressive vision of the internet?
I think these are two separate matters. Acceding to the ITRs, as I understand it, probably requires ratification, that is approval by the Indian Parliament. And I well understand that that might be a complex process in a very vibrant democracy as you have in India. Independently of that formal process, India could kind of implicitly reverse its position and say, now in light of the Snowden revelations and all that, we understand actually there was nothing wrong with the ITRs. And I'm happy to explain why from a legal point of view to anybody who would be interested and go into more depth on that. So, okay, we're not acceding because that's a complicated process, but in spirit we are signatories to that. And then follow up on that and say, look, this was unfinished business. We failed to reach agreement. That's regrettable. We do have to make some changes because if we just try the same thing again, we will not find agreement, but let's continue the process. And then the question, which you haven't asked, but is where to continue the process. Brazil may or may not be an opportunity. The WSIS process may or may not be an opportunity. The ITU plenipotentiary may or may not be an opportunity. So really this requires some thinking and some evaluation, but I think that India could, together with Brazil, South Africa, which are the three clearly democratic BRICS. Some people think Russia is democratic, some people think not. I think China, most people would not think it's democratic. But those three, South Africa, India, and Brazil, clearly are Western democracies in terms of their political structure. They could ally and say, look, we as the democracies feel certain things should be done. In particular, stop this mass surveillance, improve privacy protection, recognize that no, there's too much concentration of wealth and we need to somehow redistribute these profits more evenly around the world. There's a taxation issue which is coming up, or even the G20 have said there's a problem there. So I think that's something you could get into.
Okay, that's all the time we have today. Thank you, Richard, for joining us, and thank you for watching.